scary. And the fact is that the conclusion, you see, we know that that economic catastrophe destroys lives. We know it. They've done the research. In the credit crunch, give you an example, 500,000 people worldwide died of stress-induced cancer. And that's just one thing. The fact is that modern life is more toxic than economic catastrophe. That's the point. So if people are forced to stop living in their normal life ways, in other words, seeking instant gratification less, having to change their lifestyle and eating a little bit healthier because they're having less fast food, for instance, they're having to socialize more and stick with their families because they're not allowed out. So in Greece, for instance, which is an economic wasteland, then people moved in with each other so that you had 3 or even 4 generations
to save money,
living together, living off the grandmother's pension.
I remember seeing that actually on the news, that she was actually funding the whole family.
Yep, and I can give you several examples that I know personally of this. The grandmother's pension, which also has been cut, by the way. And to give you an example, I have an uncle.
Big time, actually, if I heard correctly.
I have an uncle and aunt who are both retired professors in Athens, and they had quite a good pension, and they had funded their son to go to university in Boston, and they'd taken out enormous loans, but all healthily calculated with nice margins of error, until the government cut their pension to 30% of what it was, and now their son has to bring them bread to eat. Okay, so but all this taken into account, economic catastrophe, because it forces people to give up on life, increases your health. And as I said last time, the main killer in modern life is stress. And just to put this into real context, to really frighten people, well, not intending to frighten them, but it is frightening. Back in the 1990s, the Royal College of Psychiatry in London, based in Grosvenor Square, where incidentally I picked up my Gaskell Medal many years ago, they started the Defeat Depression campaign. And their objective was to increase awareness, improve the treatment of depression. Hasn't really worked, though, has it? Depression was the 5th commonest cause of death and illness 20 years ago. It is now the commonest. And that is because it's not depression we're dealing with. It's unhappiness. It's the fact that we are not designed for the modern life we live in. We are stressed and our bodies are stuffed full of cortisol.
And from previous podcasts, I remember you saying, if I'm not mistaken, that we now have too much choice. And too much choice in itself is making people unhappy.
Stresses you.
Because it stresses you. Now, what is interesting with this pandemic, to bring it on a full circle, is it's taken away most of that choice. Mm-hmm. Yes, you can still shop online, but you now can't go to that shopping centre. You can't go to that coffee bar with 15 cakes that are lovely. For example, I can mention a carrot cake or a chocolate cake as 2 great examples. No idea why. But you don't have that choice anymore. So suddenly people who have never had to, I call it, dig deep into themselves, get to know themselves, think about the normal standard things, i.e. what you just talked about. What makes you happy?
Well, free will, therefore, is therefore not necessarily that good for you, is it?
The thing is, people have been conditioned this way now for so many years. And as we saw when the first lockdown was created, which was, I think, on a similar level, and bear with me with this, it's not even an analogy. If you look at the marketing campaign for Brexit and you look at the scaremongering campaign for the coronavirus, it's the same, because actually it's full of lies. It wasn't. We were not going to save this amount of money written on the side of a bus. And who was that person who was leading the Brexit campaign with false figures that were based on opinion? That actually were not fact, that we would be saving so many hundreds of thousands or millions per week for the NHS.
You mean the same type of false figures that are used for corona right now.
I mean, this guy was had blonde hair, a bit.
And you know that the figures used for lockdown,
a blumbering kind of individual. I think he had something to do with London for a while.
Somebody who we decided, we had high hopes initially last year.
We did,
and we have rapidly reversed our opinion of him.
We have, and what is frightening is, you've said it, I think, in conversation on the last podcast, is, your comments were, I don't know if this was online or offline, were, does Boris actually believe in what he's saying?
Well, the thing is, he is fairly transparent. You can tell. Yeah. When he was, as I said last week, when he was talking about funding for the military, he was inspiring. He was riveting. If you hear him talking about coronavirus, he's hesitant and
why was
false.
That, do you think? Why was he, I would use the word believe, but why was he convincing when he was talking about the military?
Because it was logical and it made sense.
Exactly. It was as factual as you can get. Whereas the coronavirus is based on individuals that sit in a room, socially distancing, I'm wondering, probably without masks, being very well paid, being incentivized by big pharmaceutical companies that they forgot to mention in any context, and yet they have the right to give advice to government on what we should do. They're fully paid, have no sense of reality, yet the decisions or the advice that they're giving to government can decimate, can remove...
Oh, that's Sage, is it?
Yes. Can remove... So one of them, who actually was the guy who we couldn't rely on, Mr. Lockdown himself, Professor Lockdown, who, as you said a few times, was caught with his trousers down, let alone anything else down.
Believed in it so much.
That he invited a married woman over for a bit of nookie.
Who's got a history of getting things wrong?
The SARS,
foot and mouth.
Bird flu, foot and mouth. I mean, how many cattle did we cull?
Millions.
That we realised later we shouldn't have done. We didn't
needlessly.
But farmers now have taken years to get back to break-even level.
That's right.
Because of that.
And nobody sued them, have they?
Based on figures that he got from where?
And this guy still has credibility. He's still allowed. He's still given a voice. How is this?
You know what I would call him? I would call him a new name. I would call him Mr. Decimal Point. Just move it.
I would call him Mr. Imaginary Decimal Point.
Just add a zero. If it's 10,000, make it 100,000. Why not?
Mr. Fat Zero.
Let's be sure.
Now,
that's ridiculous.
Now and
we're basing government decisions on this.
Correct.
And yet we have evidence, factual evidence, historical evidence that it was not true.
And they are allowed. They are allowed also.
And yet they're still doing it now.
They're allowed also to present projections to the population.
And with what kind of data? That they've admitted recently is actually out of date.
Not only out of date, but they are unable to tell you themselves the degree of false positive. If they know it, if they don't, as Mike Yeadon said, shame on them. And yet I have a better word for them if they do know it. And it's up to the Tower of London for most of them, I'm afraid.
So somebody is closing down their business, closing down the shutter, 2 locks on the key, for 3 or 4 weeks at a time, not able to have any revenue, which puts food on the table for them and their kids. And they are then watching people, as we discussed before, like Cummins, like Mr. Professor, whatever his name was, Ferguson, people who are supposed to be respected, actually not even following their own advice. And yet these people have to stop earning a living, get into more debt or just debt if they had a good, viable business, and still follow the rules, even though it's against maybe their common sense or their beliefs.
And what about Professor Whitty, who recommends that we don't cuddle our grandparents this Christmas?
What a thing to say! And
he tries to sound reasonable. I mean, as if someone who has clear Asperger's as he does. When's the last time he cuddled anyone?
Clearly, it must be because if you have any understanding, we were discussing the word, any empathy with humanity, with society, with your fellow human being, and we've been 8 months through this now, not 8 weeks.
You know you don't get close to that. You don't mention it.
It's not. On what level is that relevant? Is it humour? Is it wit? What is that?
Is it sage medical advice? Clearly not.
Clearly not. It's an opinion that is so out of touch, so with the lack of timing, that is so beyond anybody's understanding, that it's actually insulting.
But masterful in manipulation, because his message is, well, you can do it, but I wouldn't advise it.
No, what he's saying in so many words: be careful not to kill your grandparents.
Correct.
That's what he's saying.
You're legally allowed to cuddle them, but you could kill them.
And that's the word that was very interesting that came out in that latest news, whether it was on BBC News or Sky. It was mentioned so quickly. It was said so quickly, even whispering in passing. Oh, we can't legally stop you cuddling your grandparent, but we're strongly advising that you don't. I mean, has it reached this point now?
Is it their job?
But has it reached this point where now even a basic human need is now governed by somebody who has no understanding?
I wonder whether I wonder whether they're testing us. I wonder whether they're seeing the tolerance of British society, of humanity, for complete nonsense. And the answer is the tolerance is pretty high. The idea that general people have common sense is in fact
not
something.
So
well, indeed, it's disappearing rapidly over the horizon, if it ever existed. Now, I'll give you an example. One of the ancient Greek, I think it was a gentleman called Hippocrates, a doctor, said, "Do not worry about things you can't directly control. Always do what you think is right, rather than worrying about your reputation. Because, of course, reputation is based heavily on perception, and therefore you can't really control the perception of others. Do what you think is right."
So explain to me why, and I've said this before in a different context, why in the 21st century, forget the 20th century, the 21st century, social multimedia century we're in, the Conservative government are not able to hire a competent person, or 2 or 3 or 5 or 10, that manage the reputation and the perception and the marketing. I'm trying to find the words. Of the government. So why can't the government manage their persona, their reputation properly?
Let's focus a little bit. We were talking about cognitive dissonance, and that sounds like a fancy term, but it isn't. It's essentially where you have two competing opinions. In other words, I'm not sure. I think it's this, but I also think it could be this. Now, that causes a certain level of unsettlement. We'll call it a little bit of stress. We'll call it cortisol. The body hates cortisol. We are designed to reduce it as quickly as we can. So what we do is we take one side. And the side that we take depends on many factors, depends on previous perceptions, on pressures on us at the time. And then what we do is we seek to make excuses. We try and avoid responsibility for our own actions. And we then seek what we call confirmation bias. In other words, we can read lots of stuff about it, but we'll only notice what agrees with us, and we'll go, there, that agrees with us. Give you an example. And this is really, really telling. But if you listen to Julia Hartley-Brewer on talk radio interviewing scientists and interviewing politicians, the scientists are very clear. They are very logical. They just roll out the facts, and there's no argument. You know, she will pressurize them because she's a journalist. She will say, well, what about this and this and this and this? And I'll say,
that's her job.
That is her job. And they will come back and say, well, that's easy. Look at this and this. Now, if you listen to her interviewing politicians, you'll hear them go, deaths are rising. And she'll go, well, actually not really, not according to seasonal norms. And they go, well, but the test, we've got to do something. And then she'll get them on that one, and then they'll go back to, but deaths are rising, we've got to do something. And they just keep on repeating that nonsense because because got to do something and protection of somebody is very hard to argue against, and that's the only thing they can stand behind. Now, one of the things that influences people greatly in terms of which way they jump when they have a cognitive dissonance is fitting in. Because we are tribal, we are designed to fit in. And here's the thing, although Hippocrates said, don't worry about your reputation because you can't really control it, unfortunately, because there are so many avenues by which our actions and our appearance are seen and observed by others, our reputation is actually fundamental to how we can function within society nowadays. And in fact, for instance, companies, eBay sellers, unless you have a rating of 99%, it's